Europe with a sound economic system, sound banking, and so on and so forth. So the question is, how do we get there? And well, it's interesting to mention the euro, because indeed, if we go back to the 90s, where the snake was in trouble, there was already here a question of method. Now, what do we do now? So some were pushing for the same currency, kind of monetary regulation, if you want, okay? So we're going to impose to the poor Italian who don't know how to manage their lira sound monetary policy. We're going to impose to all those. And personally at that time, I was on the other side. I thought we should move the other way and have more competing currency and then see what happened. You know, maybe the Dutch mark will have taken part of trade in Central Europe. Even maybe we'll have ended up with 2 or 3 currencies in Europe. You know, I have no idea. But the point is there. How do we get to the safe harbor without too much trouble? I do believe that competition is the best way to get it there. And I think, unfortunately, as the European elections are coming to many people, ambition goes with regulation. So if we want a good Europe, a safe Europe, we need more regulation. And I think this is a fundamental mistake. I think what we need is to make people liable. Look at the bank. I'm not a bank expert. Some people here obviously on that panel are much more expert than me. But what do we need? Do we need like the N+1 regulation of the banking system? Do you really put a lot of faith in this new union? Or do we have a clear example of failure of responsibility, of accountability on the part of bankers? And if yes, why? So should we move towards making bankers more responsible for what they do? Or should we just try to control them and have a system which is going to look very much maybe like the one in the US that didn't perform that well, actually? It seems to me that you have some banking systems which are more decentralized, I don't know, in Canada or other places, again, you know better than me, and who went through the crisis in a more tranquil way. So I think the point is here, we need to go to that safe harbor, and I think competition and responsibility are what's going to get there, you know, safely.
One of the main benefits of the American system is to, in the ideal world, to have as little federal government as possible and have certain, well, particular states compete each other and basically be a kind of experiment. And then the society can see what's working and what is not. But in Europe, the only point in the terms of financing was the specific experience of national regulation. And I might want to recall you that back in 2007, Spain was considered a success story. The one that somehow knew how to get their banking system right. And this appraisal only lasted for about a year or two. So what I would like you to think about is whether this type of experimentation, if you like, is it European enough in terms that there are clear fields where we want competition, we want regulate, or are there certain fields where we want to have as uniform regulation, obviously as little regulation as possible, but no experimentation at all?
I think it's a long process. What I do think and what I've seen in the financial markets is that some financial institutions have tried to sort of, they knew a few years ago that it can't be avoided, you know, because the aftermath, you know, shocks were too big. And especially the big banks started to adapt very quickly, and the market saw that, you know. So the answer for all sort of private initiative or everyone who's really in the market is to sort of see where the regulation is going and be 3 steps ahead of it, you know, because then the market will benefit you. Otherwise, if you sort of, how should I put it, refuse, you know, to sort of see where the train is going, you essentially, I think, exponentially increase the cost of regulation for the taxpayer. I think that unfortunately happened in Slovenia, because we sort of downplayed the whole situation for a couple of years. So we got some nice stress tests, which cost us a lot of money, defined, how much capital, would potentially be lacking, in the banks. But what we discovered, the state simply converted deposits into equity, which were there all the time. So the lesson is, why wait for 3 years to convert the deposits you can't pull out from the banks anyway into equity? So why, I'll say it now, why lie to the population that basically there's no problem, there's no chance that this might happen? Well, because it is a political question also. It's not a question of, what needs to be done. It's a question, how can we do it and what needs to happen so we can do it. I think that's a bit of a thing that we need to see with the European Union, because a lot of people know what should be done, but there's a lot of discomfort to sort of come out with ideas to sort of, get things moving faster, I think.
You made the point about, the political pressures on the central regulators obscuring or preventing them telling the truth. Well, I actually, forgive me, took the trouble of making a few notes on that subject, which I lifted from a paper by my dear colleague Kevin Dowd, who's about to publish a paper called Math Gone Mad. And I think he starts off by mentioning Voltaire's quote, which I remember from reading Candide as a young boy: anything too stupid to be said is sung. And in the field of banking and economics, Ronald Coase, who sadly died a few months ago, took that up by saying anything too stupid to be analysed is put into a mathematical model. And in the central banking regulators, since this crisis started, have achieved a very, very poor report card in my view. So after Northern Rock crashed in 2007, the focus then turned on to the Icelandic banks. I remember being called in the city and people were saying, hey, these credit default swap spreads, these are indicators of markets being extremely concerned that these banks are going to go bust very soon. They were then trading 10–15%. So, you could, if you wanted to guarantee £1 million of Icelandic bank 5-year debt, you get a premium of 10–15% per annum for that. That's extremely unusual. I've never seen that in my career. So the European authorities called in the IMF, who then produced a report in August 2008 responding that the Icelandic banking system was resilient. October 2008, it completely crashed. 2009, we then have the banking crisis ripping out throughout Europe. Before the ECB really got established, we had a committee of European banking supervisors, the forerunner to the ECB. They then supervised or produced a stress test report on the 22 largest banks in Europe, and they concluded using these regulatory capital, utterly pointless rules. Don't look at regulatory capital, look at market capital, that based on their estimates of stress, all 22 banks were completely safe. And then they repeated the exercise again in 2010 as further banks and sovereigns began to crash. There they extended the test to the largest 91 banks in Europe, accounting for 2/3 of all European banking assets. They then concluded that at a capital ratio of 6% core capital to assets, only 6 of the 91 banks had any problems at all. And the total shortfall of capital was €3 billion, €3.5 billion. Absolute peanuts. Markets reacted very strongly to that, and very senior commentators, I think Willem Bijt of Citibank said this is rubbish, and then Madame Christine Lagarde, who at the time was Finance Minister of France, responded by saying, right, we're going to make these stress tests stronger, effectively admitting that they weren't stress tests at all, they're just a PR exercise. So they repeated the test 2 months later and concluded that 1 or 2 may have deeper problems, but signed off on major banks like Dexia, who 1 month after the sign-off spectacularly crashed. Later that year, 2010, the entire Irish government debt system collapsed. I go on for the whole series of these tests, and I mean, I think the phrase, trying to pick up your invitation to keep people alive, the phrase lipstick on a pig applies to any attempt to produce any form of stress test. And I can assure you that I will come back here to this stage in a year's time and push a P with my nose all the way around it if anybody reaches the conclusion that the outcome of the present raft of the ECB stress test is going to shed any light whatsoever on the health of these banks. And for so long as banks are allowed to report a value at risk, so to make things clear, if I were to lend our chairman 10 euros, that goes on the balance sheet as 10 euros of assets, need and risk. If we do a derivative, then we mark down not the notional amount of the derivative, not the payments, but the so-called value at risk. For time reasons, I'll just stop it there. But the value at risk of the World Trade book in January 2012 was halved from $120 billion to $60 billion. That's just one small portfolio within JP Morgan. The total losses was $6,000 million. So the ratio of reported risk to actual losses was 1%. So if banks are understating their true exposure in some of the derivative markets by a factor of 99 times, then I just think the task that the regulators are setting in fixing this through mathematical models is pointless.
But would more Europe be the solution or less Europe in that position?
Smarter Europe. And I think if I was to be given 10 seconds in front of Mario Draghi, I would say if there's one solution to this, is let's pass a new European law. Let's ban regulatory stress tests. Let's have any other form of accountability. Let's say that, the paper that recently published with Kevin, let's say that if you are a main board director or a level of manager of a certain seniority and your bank fails and taxpayer bailouts are required, your personal assets will be lost before any taxpayer bailout funds occur. I really think this banking crisis is so bad it brings to mind a questioning of the principle of limited liability.
But I remember reading Stiglitz, I think it was a paper in 2006 or 5, where he say that there is nothing to be worried about with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. That it's totally safe and sound, and at best the taxpayer will spend, I don't know, say something like $20 million. As we know, the figure is well above that. My point is a very simple one, and then it goes to your question. I mean, what is the core job of a banker? It's basically managing risk. That's their job. I mean, this is the main thing, playing with a balance sheet, and this is their profession. And all those stress tests are trying to replace what bankers are supposed to do. So I think that there is something we should put in Europe. It's not just tell people we run stress tests, don't worry, now everything is fine, or coming with a Basel 3, 4, 5, 6, or whatever. It's really trying to understand why, and here we need simple rules. I agree, why bankers are not doing their business any longer, or why don't they manage risk as they should? I'm not the expert, but Gordon mentioned liability, and we probably have to go as deep as that and see, of course, the fact that bankers at the European Central Bank are also playing some kind of funny game, you buy my thing, I buy yours. I mean, I'm not an expert on those things, but obviously it doesn't sound very, very clean. But yeah, so regulation is not the solution to those problems, but we need to do something, and that thing is to make, again, bankers liable for, as we say, profit, but also losses, and make sure they manage risk as they know how to.